Let's take a few moments for the photos while I introduce my guests from left to right. Amir Jadidi, who plays the role of Rehim. Next to him in the middle, Asghar Farhadi, who of course no longer needs an introduction. And next to him, Alexandre Malegui, co-producer and distributor of the film. I know there are already a lot of questions, people who have already asked for the mic. Perhaps the first could stand up.
ضمن خسته نباشی با آقای فرهادی. آقای فرهادی، یه بخشی از مخاطبین فارسی زبان شما همیشه این انتقاد رو داشتن که فیلم‌های شما
to Mr. Farhadi. Some members of your Iranian audience criticize you for not tackling the difficulties of the Iranian people. In what way does this film bring an answer to these criticisms? When you describe a certain group, they do not distinguish themselves from the rest of society. For example, when we tell the story of a family, this family is not outside of a context or outside of society. And therefore, these people who are critical perhaps have a desire to see a more frontal confrontation with issues, and perhaps they find my cinema too peremptory, too straightforward. The attraction of the artistic and cinematographical approach is a more nuanced and subtle approach. I think that all the films which I make always have the same starting point, which is the desire that my viewer should not get bored and should not regret having spent 2 hours of their life discovering my film. With regards to the themes which are tackled, I would say that there are two ways of confronting these themes. Either we directly criticize a system, that is the standpoint of some filmmakers, or you examine, study, and criticize society. To take a close look at society, for some people, means to not criticize the system. However, all those issues are interconnected, and perhaps in my films, this gaze, this angle exists, and that perhaps presupposes a deeper look at the film.
Good morning. My name is Chaz Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times and RogerEbert.com. Monsieur Farhadi, I am so glad to see you back in competition here at Cannes, and you've made another beautifully nuanced movie where we confront philosophical issues about, is there an absolute truth to truth, integrity, ethics? And I want to know, in this particular movie, were you trying to show us that perhaps with social media and the way that we're looked at and trying to gain approval from how other people see us, that it adds even another layer of our own inner integrity or truth?
نکته اولی که میخوام بگم اینه که در واقع فیلم موضوع اصلی شبکه‌های اجتماعی نیست و موقعی که من می‌نوشتم یا
The first thing I would like to say is that the main theme of the film
اتفاق میفته تو داستان
is not social media.
تصمیم بگیرم یه قصه‌ای بنویسم.
For me, that is just one aspect of the story.
و هیچ موقع هم دنبال این
I
نبودم و
didn't have any particular aims in using this theme. I never wanted either to praise nor to criticize social media. It is simply an omnipresent phenomenon, at least for the new generation in my country, which has its own specificities, which I don't want to judge either personally or in this film. However, the image reflected by social media of events in the life of a person, which is close to the image reflected by the media, contaminates the entire existence of this person. A person at a given time does a good deed. It is highlighted by the social media and elicits admiration for the community to whom he belongs. And that creates expectations regarding all the other aspects of his life and all of his environment. And if the next day the man smokes a cigarette in front of his sister, the social media will tell him to stop. Therefore, he has to become irreproachable and perfect in all of the aspects of his life. It's like the people who read the posts on social media invent a new story and a new identity for this man, which alienates him. The expectations which are elicited within the group, within the society, is that there should be a consistency in the man's behavior. And that is what I want to denounce, or at least to describe. Because for filmmakers as well, we have the right to be imperfect. We can't have a smooth image. A smooth image is something we can see from afar and which can give the appearance of something which is enviable. However, it means you no longer have the opportunity of failing, of being imperfect. However, we cannot make progress without making mistakes. On this subject, which we are talking about, because the phenomenon is extremely complex and we can't talk about all its dimensions here. But with regards to this image which is elicited through social media, it is a very important dimension. I don't want to talk at length about this, but another interesting aspect of social media, which I would like to mention here, even if it's not directly linked to the film, is the extremely fast pace and succinct dimension of social media. This speed of the transmission of information has to be a simplification. It does not allow one to express the complexity of an event or of a story. And cinema has this power. It has the ability to take the time to develop and to nuance. That's why social media create many misunderstandings, and by their essence, social media lend themselves to polemical interpretations and dubious interpretations. From Radio Fada, yesterday there was a conversation with the magazine Variety, where he said that in Iran there was no freedom of expression and that Iran was a repressive country. We know that after the riots which took place in Iran, or after the incident of the Ukrainian plane, in what measure do you feel that you have to mention these events in your film? And to what extent do you look at the past histories of the people you work with? For example, your actor has already worked in films which are made by the institutions linked to the Iranian state. I will try to answer briefly. Yes, with regards to the interview with Variety, if you look at the person who is translating the press conference for me yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that maybe not in Europe, but at least in Iran, we believe, people believe outside Iran that there are no social media in our country, and we were talking about the fact that maybe not in Europe, but at least in Iran, we believe, people believe outside Iran that there are no social media in our country, and so my interviewer was surprised. He asked whether the social media were really so present in Iran. I said, yes, I think they're probably even more present in our youth, amongst our youth, than they are in Western countries. And he said, why? Well, I said, well, because the atmosphere is so closed, we could even say oppressive. Perhaps the English word is different, says the speaker, but a social media allows one to open up a space where one can talk. In a society where you can speak freely, you don't need social media so much in order to be able to do this. All the events which you have just mentioned, of course they happened, but to what extent I react to these subjects? Well, there are two options for reacting. Please forgive me if I talk a bit at length. I would like there to be some questions also for my co-workers. The first time when we were talking about the execution of young people under the age of 18 in Iran, I think the Enfant de Belfine is the film which tackled this subject directly. If at that time I had signed a petition against this, would we remember it now? No, we wouldn't. However, thanks to this film, we are still thinking about these delinquents or people who commit a murder at the age of 14. Does that person have sufficient responsibility for his actions? Or if he then matures and cannot take but until that point cannot take responsibility for his actions, should we judge him? And that, to me, was a subject at the heart of Les Enfants de Belleville. If I hadn't made that film, as you are suggesting, and if at the time I had taken a social position, if I had written a text, that is not my mode of expression. I am not someone who chooses this as a mode of expression. I express my thoughts through a film. I like putting questions through my films. I feel that I have a greater impact despite all the problems we are all aware of. It is my choice. It is the mode of expression which I have chosen. I feel that making society aware, to raise awareness, is what allows society to advance. If you confront ignorance, you will work for justice. Some people only work against injustice or against ignorance. In my film, to the extent that I have the capacities and the skills, including intellectual abilities, and I'm not always certain of this, I always doubt my own methods. I try to generate an awareness through my films. With regards to my actors, I see them as actors, and I hope to give them the opportunity of personifying to their best the characters. The films that they have worked for in the past, it's not something I look at. I don't look at their filmography. I think that they can bring their best to my film, and I give them that opportunity. And outside of that, of course, I feel that they are free to live their lives and maybe even to hold opinions which are opposite to mine. We are confronted with extremism, with dogmatic behavior. We cannot allow ourselves to become extremists or dogmatic. We cannot allow ourselves to become the same as those whom we are criticizing. Please, I apologize for the length of my answer.
مجله تصویر می‌خواستم سوال از شما بکنم که شما در دو فیلم
represent the magazine, doing تصویر, in a separation and film about Ellie, you tackle the topic of judgment and lies. Do you believe there is a greater fracture in Iranian society on these topics, and that the crisis in Iranian society not only has not disappeared but has become worse? And what have been the difficulties in interpreting the roles in this film? And thank you. Someone who has always been present in this festival. Unfortunately, we have lost this precious man. It was the father of this gentleman, Ali Moamem, who was one of the greatest reviewers. So I'm very glad to be able to pay tribute to him through the presence of his son. Mr. Moalem, I think that this film doesn't particularly tackle judgment or lies. However, this subtext is always present in my films, not so much because they are themes which I choose to tackle, but because they are stories which I tell, and therefore these questions are intrinsically present. None of my films can escape the recurrence of these topics. Those topics, if we find answers to them, it will not make our society perfect. That's not what I am trying to say. This is a complex situation. What I found interesting to explore here was the ambivalence between lies and truth. The line between truth and lie is a continuum. It is not a clear line. Systems want to present things in right and wrong, black and white. But for people who live in a society, we see that what is good for one person can be not so good for another person. So each person must be able to judge for themselves what is right or wrong, true or false for them. And so this question of judgment and even of the definition of truth was not my original intent. I did not think one day, oh, I will make a film about truth. The idea for this film came from my theatrical studies, from the sentence said by Brecht. Thank you very much. I am honored by your comments. There were a lot of challenges for me in interpreting this role. The character's gait, his way of speaking, his accent. I fell in love with this character, and so I did all this with great commitment and pleasure. I didn't suffer from challenges each time I met with a difficulty. I had help from Mr. Farhadi, who allowed me to overcome the various obstacles and helped me to play this role. Asghar Farhadi and Amir Jadidi, I would like you to talk a bit more about your method of work was for this film, how you prepared the roles, what were the discussions, what were the rehearsals, how did that all happen?
همون شیوهی که قبلا کار میشد ولی اینجا خیلی مفصل‌تر.
My usual method, but it was much more extensive here because we were working during the pandemic, and so therefore all the extra time that we had was used for extra rehearsals and for working on the screenplay. So in fact we had an extra year thanks to the pandemic in order to prepare. But if I were to talk more specifically about the rehearsals, I would say they would be much more even.
آقای تنابنده که به خاطر
Or I would have liked the other actors to be present. Mr. Tanabenen wasn't able to come because he wasn't able to get a visa, but also the other extraordinary actors who were in front of the camera for the first time and whom for the most part came from the town of Shiraz. I told them all that it was a question of working to represent everyday people, straightforward people, even innocent people. And I realized it's much more difficult to play a straightforward character compared to someone more complex. The line between simplicity and being simplistic and a certain naivety is very fine. And so that's what I worked on a lot with them. If these characters had been a bit more complex, had dark facets to their personalities, if they had been used to being confronted with more complex situations, they would not have been in the situation they were in the film. And therefore, in our rehearsals, which we did very extensively, I was myself very impressed by the energy which Amir put into his work, and he is right when he said that he had the behavior of a man who was in love. He was extremely passionate, committed, and our work together became almost a fearful memory because I wonder whether I will be able to experience this again, having so much energy within a team. As Mr. Farhadi has just said, we rehearsed extensively, as I also said in my answer to Mr. Mourlem, to play a straightforward, innocent character in order for their simplicity must not be clumsy, to prove that he nevertheless has his own intelligence and his own subtlety. We tried in our work to embody this even through a particular way of walking. For example, we could have made him a little clumsy. We had to avoid that. The accent from Shiraz, not only did I need to work on my intonation and my lines, but the accent in Shiraz was a challenge, but an additional burden. I had to concentrate both on the way of speaking of the character, his intonation, his way of expressing himself, but also this accent from Shiraz, and that added to the difficulties.
Hi, Asghar, it's always a pleasure to meet you and to see your film. Congratulations. Amir coming here from Israel, Yediot Achronot. Do you aware that your films are very popular in Israel? And how do you feel about it? And in the competition, there is a movie of Israeli director who critiques very much Israel, the movie of Nadav Lapid. Usually in sports, the athletes from Iran quit when they have to compete with Israeli athletes. This time it's not the case, of course. So thank you again for your films.
تماشاگرایی که میان یک فیلم رو ببینن نیازی نداره که دم در پاسپورتشون نشون بدن، نیازی نداره که بگن ما
The viewers who go to see a film don't need to show a passport to say whether they are man or woman, what their nationality is. They become a single body, and I feel that it is like just one person is watching a film, even when there are 100 viewers in the audience. It is one of the great qualities of cinema that each person can establish their own bond with a film, and that these boundaries do not exist in art. When I see a beautiful statue in Italy, I don't wonder which country, which culture, which ideology was that of the artist. I simply admire the work, the masterpiece. In my country, there is something I've always been very proud of. It is that even in the most religious works, even if one's outlook is entirely different, and that you look at the Sheikh mosque, you are extremely moved by this work of art, and you create a relationship with this work of art, irrespective of the context of its creation. For me, more people can see the film and can think about the film for a few minutes after having seen it is something which I'm appreciative of.
Hello, Mr. Farhadi. I have a question. For me, I had the impression the central themes in the character in the film were the relationship between money and honor. Could you explain or comment on that, or the kind of the ambivalence and the conflicts there? Thank you.
توی در واقع همه فیلم‌ها علاوه بر فیلمایی که کار کردم، نه همه از فکر می‌کنم درباره الی.
Maybe not in all my films, but at least in About Ellie, in parallel to the issue of judgment and of lies, there is also an allusion to this aspect. I was very surprised. In fact, I didn't realize I was making films about judgment and lies, but now I've got used to people picking up on those themes within my films. The other very important theme is that of reputation, of honor, in the sense of reputation, which is a very important concept in Iranian society. By reputation, I mean the collective image given off by an individual. Perhaps it is something very pregnant in your societies as well, but in Iran it is essential. Someone is ready to lose everything in order to retain your reputation, the image which society has of you. The serenity and the sense of confidence that comes from knowing you have a good reputation is such that in order to maintain this, you end up in a kind of ambivalence about your own life. There is a difference between the image which you give and then your actual real life. And in this film, in order for this man to maintain this reputation which he has accidentally obtained, he loses everything in order to be able to maintain it. He even comes to making an immoral action in order to maintain the reputation which has been conferred on him through his previous moral action. Unfortunately, and with a certain degree of caution, I would like to say that reputation has a very important role in our society. Sometimes an impossible importance. And everybody knows this challenge also existed. What the other people know about an individual, what an individual thinks about someone else is not necessarily what is true to that person. It is perhaps one of the subjects which has been the least tackled in cinema, and it is considered as a value, as something which is positive, but which can also bring about great difficulties. The interpreter apologizes, but didn't hear the question. For me, the question of money is just a pretext.
این به هر حال بخش شخصیت پردازی و بخش پرداخت وضع اقتصادی که اینا دارن بله ولی تم
the way in which the characters are described, their financial situation of course is important, but when we talk about the theme of the film, if you had to summarize the film in 3 words, the word money would not be among them.
اینکه چه تمی رو آدم از هر فیلمی بگیره بستگی داره از چه پنجره‌ای به اون فیلم نگاه میکنه. و خوشبختانه
The theme of a film depends on the gaze you have on that film, on the window you open out onto that film, and according to yourself and your own preoccupations, of course, you will open a different window onto the film. I think that it is one of your best films, and congratulations, Mr. Jajidi, for your acting. The question of truth, is truth something precise?
فیلمسازیتون نظرتون راجع به این قضیه تغییر کرده بعد از ساختن فیلم تو فرهنگ‌های مختلف و اینها؟
Can we talk about an unequivocal truth? The fact that you have traveled and worked in other countries, has that changed your perception of truth? We see the steps of this archaeological site, and there are a lot of steps in this film. It's only been 24 hours, but what is the importance of steps in your work? So let's not yet talk about steps, because it would be a importance of steps in your work. So let's not yet talk about steps, because it would be a shame to say too much about that particular aspect. We need to take a step back. We will talk about this when we have digested the film a little more. With regards to my own experience, I'm not yet particularly old, and I have not yet had a lot of experiences. There has been an evolution. I don't think there has been any radical change, or that I should have changed what I think. But when you travel through other cultures, you compare and you examine and study, and therefore I think that migration, other than when it is inflicted, I think that migration is something which is very positive in this regard. When I go to Spain, I compare things. I then also realize what my own culture has to offer, but then I also realize what its faults are. When I came to France, I said to Berenice in one scene, I said, you need to make this announcement gently. For her, gently meant to say it in a low voice. But for me, in Farsi, when I say gently, it means that it is something which you announce progressively. How she didn't understand how we could announce something progressively, step by step. In the Coen brothers films, when you want to kill someone, you shoot them directly in the head. You don't do it step by step. You don't make him suffer. All these are cultural dimensions. These differences, these nuances are things which we become aware of. And so therefore we also become more aware of our own values. Unfortunately, the circumstances that our Iranian people are living in mean that we are in between a total sense of condescension and megalomania. In one sense, we think that we have all the qualities, we are the center of the world, and at other moments we think that we are worthless. But no, we are like all the peoples of the world. We have qualities and riches, but also failings and faults. These all are our relative values. Traveling allows us to assess one's own culture more precisely, and I also experienced that. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Farhadi, and your French co-producer, how this production collaboration started and how it is continuing, because you are now both co-producers. We started to work. Well, I discovered about Ellie at the Berlin Film Festival several years ago. I bought the film. I was the distributor for About Ellie, and we wanted to continue working together on A Separation and also the next one, where we were distributor in France, but also sellers for the international markets. And then we were distributors, and we were together in this adventure. Asghar wanted to make a film called The Past. I convinced him to make a film in France. And then I think Asghar wanted to alternate to projects in Iran with projects abroad, and we worked together on The Salesman, which was shot in Iran. My function as a producer was simply that of finding financing and of getting the film known across the world. And everybody knows the Spanish project. Always alternating projects in Iran and projects in other countries. And A Hero is an Iranian film. For this project, did you work together like you did for The Salesman? Yes. In defense of The Salesman, we had decided to do a part of the post-production in France. It was complicated with the pandemic. We ran out of time, but we finally managed. But this latest film involved French collaboration.
یکی از شانس‌های بزرگ من در واقع همکاریه با الکسا. ما بیشتر دو تا دوست هستیم تا دو تا همکار. یعنی ما
I am very lucky. My collaboration with Alexander, who is a friend more than someone I work with, and I think we will continue.
ما نگاهمون به سینما خیلی
One of the things which allows us to work well together is that we have a very similar approach to cinema. Every time I like a film, he also likes it, and when he dislikes a film, I watch it, and it is very reassuring for me. It is a collaboration which is full of respect. Alexander likes Iran a lot. I remember the first time I sent him a text message to say that I have a story which takes place in Shiraz. He was delighted because it's a city which he loves. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to come because of the pandemic, but he thinks that Shiraz is a city which is beautiful and which makes him dream. There is a cultural relationship, I'd say, between us. He has a lot of respect for my country's culture. It enriches my professional life. It's this friendship and this collaboration with Alexander. We have become a family. From RFI, thank you very much for this film, which was also a moving portrait of Iranian society, even though the film centered on Rahim. I would like to talk about a commitment spoken of by Jean-Paul Sartre. In what regard is your film an implicit a commitment against the death penalty in Iran?
حتما در واقع این موردی که گفتین حتما این فیلم مخالفه در واقع با خودکشی.
The subject which you have brought up is relevant given that the film is against suicide and death penalty. I don't know how a filmmaker could be against that question. What do you mean by commitment? Do you mean the commitment of the character or of the filmmaker?
ببخشید من متوجه نشدم.
مرسی. ژان-پل سارتر جمله‌ای
Jean-Paul Sartre
تعهدی داره در برابر کسایی که ازش
says that the artist has a responsibility to be politically committed. In your films, there are two subjects which are indirectly mentioned: suicide of prisoners and the death penalty. At the end of the film, he decides to help. Please don't spoil the film. Do you, like Jean-Paul Sartre, also believe that there is a degree of a committed standpoint in this film? I also noted that with the female character, when she says, I decide what I do with my life, these are things which are mentioned in a very indirect manner, but it seems to be more important than the money or topics brought up by other people. Yes, everyone sees the film from their point of view. Are you Iranian?
متولد افغانستان هستین. ممکنه برای جوابی مثل افغانستان مثل ایران از یه زاویه‌ای نگاه بشه به
Maybe in an Afghan or Iranian society,
نگاه میکنه.
perhaps we see the film through another angle, through another window compared to other societies. With regards to what Sartre said, the word commitment is, or engaged, is a wide one in terms of how it can be interpreted. We can talk about a political commitment or an awareness raising of society. In Iran, we have Dear Khuda, who has spent relevant, given that the film is against suicide and death penalty. I don't know how a filmmaker could be against that question. What do you mean by commitment? Do you mean the commitment of the character or of the filmmaker?
ببخشید معصومه من متوجه نشدم.
مرسی.
Jean-Paul Sartre
تعهدی داره در برابر کسایی که ازش
says that the artist has a responsibility to be politically committed. In your films, there are two subjects which are indirectly mentioned: suicide of prisoners and the death penalty. At the end of the film, he decides to help. Please don't spoil the film. Do you, like Jean-Paul Sartre, also believe that there is a degree of a committed standpoint in this film? I also noted that with the female character, when she says, I decide what I do with my life, these are things which are mentioned in a very indirect manner, but it seems to be more important than the money or topics brought up by other people. Yes, everyone sees the film from their point of view. Are you Iranian?
متولد افغانستان هستین. ممکنه برای جوابی مثل افغانستان مثل ایران از یه زاویه‌ای نگاه بشه به
Maybe in an Afghan or Iranian society,
نگاه میکنه.
perhaps we see the film through another angle, through another window compared to other societies. With regards to what Sartre said, the word commitment is, or engaged, is a wide one. In terms of how it can be interpreted, we can talk about a political commitment or an awareness raising of society. In Iran, we have Dear Khuda, who has spent his entire life creating a dictionary of Farsi. At the time, he was perhaps thought of as someone who was reclusive, who was not committed in society, and yet the knowledge he brought to Iranian society has been fundamental, and so therefore the definition of commitment can also change, and it is only in retrospect that we can sometimes realize how some people were committed, and conversely, some people who say they're extremely committed have actions which can maybe be forgotten the very next day. I think that as a filmmaker, if you are sincere and if you don't think about all the marginal consequences of the release of your film, and that you are just concentrated on what your film has to say, you are looking to improve something in the world through your film, and everyone has their own definition of what this improvement would be. For me, improvement means that my child can ask questions and that he dares ask any question. When I say my child, it's not just mine, it's any child. if one day we could be in a world without taboos, without forbidden questions, I would feel that we would be at the start of a real change. Any other questions? Hi. Leila Mardazi, The Independent. Yesterday, I already said when I met you what I thought about the film and your interpretation. I would like to ask you a question about the writing. When you go to see this film, you're not necessarily expecting to see a thriller, but when you are in front of it, that's how you experience it. There is an element of suspense which is recurrent in the film. We never know which side it's going to end up on. So my question is about the process of writing, which of course is at the heart of the way you work. You are a great writer, and I would like to know whether there's a particular event which made you want to tell the story of this hero.
اینکه در واقع این شکل روایت در فیلم وجود داره، تریلر وجود داره، حالت معمایی و پلیسی فیلم
That dimension,
در واقع نیاز دارم.
thriller of suspense is essential for me. It is a need that I have as an author. Films which are very realistic, but films which only talk about daily life without suspense would be films which would be somewhat boring and which would not make you want to see them other than perhaps the true cinephiles. For me, the thriller is a way of trying to attract a wide audience to my film. I don't want to reduce the circle of the audience to whom I am trying to address the film. It is the people in Iran or elsewhere who make the success of a film. I think that the audience likes to hear stories. This way of telling a story is specific to me. With regards to the original trigger, I don't precisely remember, but for many years, this idea of a completely ordinary person who makes an altruistic action and who suddenly finds himself at the center of a community with all eyes upon him, and who suddenly becomes a hero only to be forgotten the next day, is the kind of story which I was reading and which I was curious about. The sudden rise followed by an equally sudden fall is something which I found interesting. I wanted to tell such a story. And so, for a period of 2 or 3 years, I collected this kind of story. Together with students, I asked them to go and look for these kinds of stories. And I found a story of someone who had found objects, lost objects, and who gave them back to their owners. I noticed that most of them had lied, that it was not actually as straightforward an action as was presented. Before doing this with my students, I will tell you all about it. Before even having done this, my students said, "Oh, those are rubbish stories, they're unbelievable." And I was saying, "But why? Why are you saying that this is too good to be true? It's not so extraordinary to hand back an object which you have found." And of course, when they went to look for these stories, they were right. They were simply stories which had been made up to boast. Other stories were only half true. Some stories were really true. And so, little by little, this subject took root in me in a very progressive and slow way. I thank you, and I hope that you will stay loyal. Sometimes I read things And I would like to thank my students and my editor who is present here, who has worked with me for many years, my director of photography, Mr. Ghazi, with whom I'd worked with for About Ellie, my assistants, Madame Gorgi, Monsieur Maral, my assistant, my director, my daughter Serena.
این قصه رو تردید داشتم بسازم یا نسازم. راستش اینقدر
I was wondering whether I was going to shoot this film
به هر حال فیلم ساختن یه
or
شور
not.
و حالی
I
میخواد. وقتی که
was uncertain.
وقتی که مدام
You
اخبار
need
بد
quite a lot of
میاد،
energy and momentum
میره. یکی از کسایی که
to make a film, and sometimes
قصه رو حتما در ایران
we can feel discouraged at times, and Serena is one of the people who encouraged me to make the film. She found it hard to agree to have a role in it, but I thank her for her.